The sky above Black Hollow looked like somebody had taken a boot to it. That was the first thing Mara Calloway noticed when the wagon rolled past the last stand of cottonwoods and the town came into view. That bruised, ugly ceiling of cloud pressing down over the buildings like it had somewhere to be and wasn't happy about the delay. Purple and gray and the color of old iron, it sat low and heavy over the main street, and the light it let through was the kind that made everything look a little older, a little worse off than it probably was. The town wasn't much to begin with. One main road unpaved and punished by rain until it was more mud than dirt. A general store with a crooked porch. A saloon with a piano that had been out of tune since before the war. A land office with a hand-painted sign that had been faded by 3 Montana summers into something barely readable. A church with a bell that didn't ring anymore because the rope had rotted and nobody had gotten around to replacing it. Mara took it all in slowly, the way a person does when they're too tired to be impressed or disappointed by anything. She was sitting up on the wagon bench beside her neighbor's hired man, a gap-toothed fellow named Dix who had agreed to carry her as far as Black Hollow in exchange for $2 silver and a jar of her preserved peaches. Dix hadn't talked much during the 3-day ride, which suited Mara fine. She hadn't had much to say. Behind her, in the wagon bed, her children slept. Ellie, 6 years old, was curled on her side with her knees pulled to her chest and her dark hair stuck to her cheek by sweat. Tommy, who had just turned 8, and believed strongly that sleeping during daylight hours was something only babies and old people did, had lost the battle somewhere around midday and was now flat on his back with one arm thrown over his face, mouth open, completely unconscious. Mara watched them for a moment over her shoulder. Then she turned back to the road. Her satchel sat at her feet. Brown leather, one buckle cracked, the strap repaired with a piece of twine she'd knotted herself. Inside it was everything she had left in the world. A deed to 140 acres in the Clearwater Valley, the marriage certificate from her second husband, $43 in cash, a folding knife that had belonged to her father, and a tintype photograph of a man she was still trying to stop grieving. Jacob Calloway had been dead for 11 weeks. She didn't let herself think about that too long. "There she is," Dick said, nodding toward the town. "Black Hollow." "I see it. You got somebody waiting for you here?" "No." Dick scratched the back of his neck. "You know anybody?" "Not a soul." He didn't say anything else. He had the good sense to understand that sometimes people were in circumstances that didn't invite a lot of questions, and Mara had the particular stillness about her of a person who was holding herself together by force of will and didn't have any extra energy to spend on explanations. She had come to Black Hollow for one reason: Cade Mercer. She'd heard the name 3 weeks ago, in a different town, from a different man, a retired county marshal who had known her second husband years before Mara ever met him. The marshal had come to pay his respects after Jacob's funeral, sat at her kitchen table with his hat in his hands, and told her plainly that the people who had driven Jacob to his death were not finished. "They want that land," he said, "and they've got the kind of reach that makes law unreliable." "I know that," Mara said. "You can't fight the Harmon Syndicate on your own. They've got lawyers in Helena and at least 2 men in the territorial legislature." He turned his hat in his hands. "You need somebody who can meet them at their own level. Somebody they'd actually think twice about crossing." "Who?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Cade Mercer." She'd asked the obvious question. He'd given her a long, measured answer. Cade Mercer was 50 miles north. He owned more cattle and more land than anybody in that part of Montana. He was known throughout the territory as a man whose word was iron and whose temper, when provoked, was something people went out of their way to avoid provoking. He was wealthy, unmarried, and by all accounts completely indifferent to the opinion of other people, which made him, in the marshal's estimation, the only man in the territory powerful enough to stand between Mara and the Harmon Syndicate without flinching. "He's also not a particularly easy man to know," the marshal added carefully. Mara had nodded. Then she'd sold her chickens, packed her satchel, gone to wake her children, and started for Black Hollow. She wasn't naive. She understood what she was doing. She was going to walk up to a stranger and ask him to risk himself on her behalf, using nothing but desperation and a legal deed as her argument. She had thought about it for 3 days on the wagon, and she had not come up with anything better, so she stopped looking for better and focused on executing the plan she had. The wagon rolled to a stop at the edge of the main street. "Far as I go," Dick said. That's fine. Mara climbed down. She reached into the wagon bed and shook Tommy's shoulder until he sat up, blinking and disoriented. Wake your sister. He looked at her with the specific resentment of a child pulled from sleep. Are we there? We're there. She lifted Ellie down herself. The little girl woke slowly, pressing her face against Mara's neck for a moment before she got her feet under her and straightened up. She had her father's eyes, serious, watching, the kind of eyes that took in a room before they made any decisions about it. Mara set her down, took her hand, and looked at Tommy until he came to stand beside her. Stay close, she said. Don't go into any buildings without me. Don't talk to strangers. Are you going to talk to a stranger? Tommy asked. Yes. Why can you and not us? Because I'm your mother. She picked up her satchel and adjusted the strap on her shoulder. Come on. They walked down the main street of Black Hollow, and people watched. That was something Mara noticed immediately. The way eyes followed them without turning heads, the way conversations dropped a register when they passed, the way a woman on the general store porch stopped sweeping and just stood there, broom in hand, watching. It wasn't unfriendly exactly. It was the cautious curiosity of a small place that didn't see many strangers and had learned not to trust the ones it did. Mara walked straight, and she didn't look at anyone who wasn't directly in her path. She had learned a long time ago that people treated you according to how you carried yourself, and she intended to be treated with respect even if she was carrying everything she owned in a cracked satchel. She stopped a man in an apron outside what looked like a feed store. Excuse me, I'm looking for Cade Mercer. The man blinked. He was round-faced and middle-aged, with the particular expression of someone who was surprised by the question, but also suddenly very interested in who was asking it. Mercer? Yes. What would a woman like yourself want with Cade Mercer? Mara looked at him for a moment. Do you know where he is or not? Something in her voice must have convinced him that elaborating on his curiosity wasn't going to get him anywhere useful. He pointed down the street toward the saloon. He was in the Dusty Crown about an hour ago. Might still be there. Thank you. She walked toward the saloon, then she stopped, looked down at her children, and reconsidered. Tommy. She crouched down to his level. I need you to sit with your sister on that bench over there. She pointed to a wooden bench outside the land office. Watch the satchel. Do not move. If anyone bothers you, you holler loud enough for me to hear inside. Can you do that? He puffed up a little, the way 8-year-old boys do when they're given a responsibility. Yes. Good. She looked at Ellie. You stay with your brother. Ellie nodded solemnly. Mara stood, handed Tommy the satchel, and went into the saloon. It was dim inside, smelling of sawdust and whiskey and the particular sourness of a room that had held too many bodies on too many afternoons. A few men sat at tables. The barman looked up when she entered and then looked again, visibly recalibrating. 2 men at the bar stopped talking. She scanned the room. He was at a table in the corner. She recognized him not from any description. The marshal hadn't been particularly specific about his appearance, but from the way the room related to him. There was a radius around his table, a space that the other patrons unconsciously maintained. Not out of fear, necessarily, or not only out of fear. More like the instinctive awareness that some people carry a kind of gravity that changes the air around them. Cade Mercer was big, she noticed first, wide through the shoulders, and the kind of big that wasn't soft anywhere. He looked to be in his late 30s, maybe 40, with dark hair going gray at the temples and a jaw that could have been cut from the same granite as the mountains outside. He was not handsome in any pretty magazine way. His face had been through things. There was a scar along his left jaw, and his nose had been broken at least once. He had the hands of a man who worked, which she registered without meaning to. He was alone at the table with a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched. He was looking at the door, which meant he had been looking at her since she walked in. Mara crossed the room. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down without being invited, because waiting to be invited was not a luxury she had time for. He watched her do this with an expression that gave away very little. Mr. Mercer, she said. I don't know you, he said. His voice was low, not unkind, but not warm either. The voice of a man who chose his words the way other people chose their steps, deliberately, without waste. No, Mara said. My name is Mara Calloway. I'm the widow of Jacob Calloway. He held title to 140 acres in the Clearwater Valley before he died 11 weeks ago. The land is now mine by law, but the Harmon Syndicate has been systematically making that law irrelevant, and unless I do something they're not expecting, they're going to take that land and my children and I will have nothing. She stopped talking. He looked at her for a long moment. "And?" he said. "And I need your name." Whatever he'd been expecting her to say, it wasn't that. She saw it. Just a flicker, barely anything, a slight adjustment in his eyes. "My name. Your name, your protection, and whatever authority comes with them. In exchange," she set her jaw. She had rehearsed this part. "I am a capable woman. I can manage a household, keep accounts, work land, and I don't make trouble. I have a deed that may include water rights the Harmon Syndicate doesn't know about yet. I'm willing to share whatever benefit comes from that land in a partnership I will honor completely." There was a silence. Someone at the bar coughed. "You're proposing a business arrangement," Cade Mercer said. "I'm proposing a marriage," Mara said, "which in this territory and this circumstance amounts to a business arrangement. I'm not asking you for anything personal. I'm asking you to put your name beside mine and make it too expensive for men like the Harmon Syndicate to keep coming at me and my children." She watched him. She had no idea what was behind that face. She didn't know if she was about to be laughed out of the saloon or quietly asked to leave. "Who told you to come to me?" he said. "A man named Harlan Briggs, former marshal." Something shifted. Not much. But Cade Mercer's jaw worked slightly, like he was deciding something in the back of his mind, and then he picked up his whiskey glass and set it down again without drinking from it. "You'd better go get your children," he said. "If they're outside alone in Black Hollow, they're going to attract the wrong kind of attention." Mara stared at him. "Is that a yes?" He looked at her steadily. "Go get your children, Mrs. Calloway." But she didn't know what it was. She wasn't going to let herself believe it was a yes until he confirmed it in plain language. But she went to get Tommy and Ellie, and when she came back into the saloon with one child on each side of her, Cade Mercer was standing up. Tommy stopped and looked at him from around Mara's elbow. "You're very big," he said. Mara closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. "Tommy?" "He is," Tommy said, unrepentant. Cade Mercer looked down at the boy. His face was unreadable for a moment. Then he said, "Probably. I haven't measured recently." He looked up at Mara. "The Justice of the Peace is at the land office until 4. That gives us about 40 minutes. Mara felt something cold move through her chest. Not fear exactly, more like the vertigo of a door opening where you expected a wall. "You're certain?" "I don't say things I'm not certain of." She looked at him. She was trying to figure out what was behind this, what calculation he was running, what he stood to gain, whether she should trust any of this. She had not come to Black Hollow expecting it to be easy, but she had also not expected it to move this fast, and fast things sometimes meant careless things. "Why?" she said. "Why what? Why would you do this? You don't know me. You have nothing to gain." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I knew Jacob Calloway. Not well, but I knew him. He was a decent man." He picked his hat up from the table. "And I know the Harmon Syndicate. I've been waiting for a reason to make things difficult for them." He settled the hat on his head. "You're a reason." It wasn't romance. It wasn't even kindness, particularly. It was something more practical than either of those things, and somehow that made Mara trust it more. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. And the entire town of Black Hollow found out in approximately 4 hours what had happened, and the reactions ranged from shocked to scandalized to openly disbelieving, which suited Mara fine. Disbelief was something she could work with. It meant they weren't afraid yet, and when they stopped being surprised and started being afraid, that was when she would know the arrangement was actually working. The ceremony took 11 minutes. The Justice of the Peace, a small man named Alderman with wire spectacles and ink-stained fingers, looked at them over the rims of his glasses with the expression of a man who was too professional to ask what he desperately wanted to ask. He read what he was required to read. Cade Mercer said what he was required to say. Mara said the same. Tommy stood against the wall with his arms crossed and watched. Ellie stood at Mara's side and held her hand. Nobody cried. Nobody was particularly moved. There were no flowers and no guests and no promises of love made, because none of those things were part of what this was. This was a legal act performed under the specific pressures of a specific situation, and Mara understood it as exactly that. When it was done, Alderman stamped the document and slid it across the desk. Mara signed it. Cade Mercer signed it. She picked up her copy and looked at it. Mara Mercer. The ink was still wet. She folded it carefully and put it in her satchel. Outside, the light had dropped and the cloud cover had settled lower, carrying the particular damp smell that precedes snow by about half a day. Cade Mercer's wagon was hitched outside. He had arranged for it while Mara was explaining things to the children, which had been its own complicated conversation. "Where are we going?" Tommy had asked. "To a ranch north of town, Mr. Mercer's ranch." "Why?" "Because we're going to live there for a while." Tommy had absorbed this. "Is he going to be our father?" Mara had looked at her son carefully. "He's going to be someone who helps keep us safe." "That's not what I asked." She had almost smiled, despite everything. "No, but it's the answer I have right now." Mercer Ranch was 6 miles north of Black Hollow, on a road that wound up through scrubby pine before opening out onto a wide, flat-topped plateau with views that went for miles. The main house was bigger than Mara expected. Not fancy, but substantial. 2 stories of rough-hewn timber with a covered porch running the full length of the front and a stone chimney at each end. A barn, a bunkhouse, outbuildings. Fenced pasture rolling away to the north, and beyond it, the dark shapes of grazing cattle against the failing light. It looked like a working place, like somewhere real things happened. A ranch hand came out to take the horses when they pulled up. He was maybe 20, with a freckled face and the easy competence of someone who'd been working stock since before he was fully grown. He looked at Mara and the children with frank curiosity, and then caught Cade's eye and managed to contain most of his reaction. "Garrett," Cade said, "this is Mrs. Mercer and her children." Garrett blinked. "Yes, sir." "They'll be staying." "Yes, sir." Inside, the house was clean in the way that places get clean when someone maintains them without particularly caring about them. Everything in its proper place, but nothing extra. No curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floor. The kitchen was functional. The parlor had 2 chairs and a lamp and a shelf of books that looked like they'd actually been read. A woman emerged from the kitchen, broad-shouldered, maybe 60, with gray hair pinned severely and an expression that was simultaneously suspicious and professionally neutral. "Mrs. Aldridge," Cade said. "This is Mara. She'll be in the house. She and the children will need the east rooms." Mrs. Aldridge looked at Mara for a long moment. Mara looked back. "How old are they?" Mrs. Aldridge asked, looking at the children. 8 and 6, Mara said. "8-year-old's going to be trouble," Mrs. Aldridge said, not unkindly. "He already is," Mara agreed. Something shifted in the older woman's face. Not warmth exactly, but recognition. The particular kinship of women who had learned to deal with difficult things by being direct about them. "There's soup on," Mrs. Aldridge said. "You all look like you haven't eaten properly in days." "We haven't," Mara said. "Come in then." That first night, Mara put the children to bed in the east rooms. A large one for the 2 of them together, with a bed that was actual furniture and not a cot, and quilts that smelled like cedar and clean storage. Ellie fell asleep within minutes. Tommy lasted longer, asking questions about the ranch, about the cattle he'd seen from the wagon, about whether there were horses he could learn to ride. Mara answered what she could and deflected the rest, and eventually he ran out of energy and went quiet. She went downstairs. The house was mostly dark. A lamp burned in the kitchen. She found Cade Mercer sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread in front of him. She could see columns of numbers, what looked like land records, something that might have been a survey map. He looked up when she came in. "Children settled?" he said. "Yes." "You can take the room at the top of the stairs. Second door on the left." "All right." She stood there for a moment. There was a particular awkwardness to this that she hadn't fully anticipated. The awkwardness of 2 strangers in one house with no script for how to behave toward each other, no established shorthand, no shared history to draw on. She had navigated grief and loss and fear over the past 11 weeks, but this specific discomfort was new. "Mr. Mercer." "Cade," he said, without looking up from his papers. She took a breath. "Cade, I want you to know that I'm aware this is a significant imposition. What you did today, I did what I chose to do, he said. You don't owe me a speech about it. I'm not. She stopped, started again. I'm trying to say thank you. He looked up then. In the lamplight, his face was all angles and shadow, the gray in his hair more visible, the scar along his jaw a pale seam. He looked at her for a moment in a way that was neither warm nor cold, just direct, assessing, honest. You're welcome, he said. He went back to his papers. Mara went upstairs. She did not sleep for a long time. She lay in the strange bed in the strange room and listened to the sounds of the ranch, the distant movement of cattle, the creak of the house settling in the cold, the wind coming down off the ridge and finding the gaps in the timber walls. She thought about Jacob, which she tried not to do in front of the children because when she thought about Jacob, she lost the careful containment she worked very hard to maintain, and she couldn't afford to fall apart in front of her children. She could afford to fall apart in this strange dark room in this stranger's house, so she allowed herself a few minutes of it, the pressure behind her eyes, the ache in her chest that never fully went away. And then she put it back where it lived and thought about practical things instead. The deed, the land, the water rights the marshal had mentioned, which she hadn't fully investigated yet, the Harmon Syndicate, which she knew primarily from the shape of its effects on her life, the legal letters, the men who rode past her property fence at odd hours, the county official who had looked at her like she was a problem to be solved rather than a person seeking redress, Cade Mercer, who had agreed to this arrangement with less conversation than most people used to decide what to have for dinner, and whose reasons she only half believed even though she didn't think he was lying to her. She thought about all of it until the wind dropped and the house went quiet and something dark and soft finally pulled her under. She was up before sunrise. Old habit. Jacob had worked before first light, and Mara had always been up with him, and the years of that had trained her body to wake whether she wanted it to or not. She dressed and went down to the kitchen and lit the stove and made coffee because she needed to do something with her hands, and making coffee was something she understood. She was just pouring the first cup when she heard boots on the porch. Cade came through the back door with cold air following him and mud on his boots and his hat in his hand. He stopped when he saw the coffee. You were up early, he said. Always am. She set a cup on the table without asking if he wanted one. He sat down. She sat across from him, and they drank coffee in the gray pre-dawn light without talking, and it was not as uncomfortable as she expected. Silence between two people who are both comfortable with silence is different from the silence between strangers who can't think of anything to say. She wasn't entirely sure which kind this was, but it wasn't unbearable. I had a look at the survey records last night, he said after a while. She looked up. The deed you have to the Clearwater Valley parcel. There's an old survey from 1871 that shows a creek boundary that runs further west than the current markers. He looked at her steadily. If the original survey holds, you have water access, not just grazing water. The headwaters of the eastern branch of Clearwater Creek run through the northwest corner of that parcel. Mara was quiet for a moment. She thought about what the marshal had said, in passing, at her kitchen table. There may be water rights they don't know about yet. How significant is that? She asked, though she already had a sense. In this territory, in a dry year? He wrapped both hands around his cup. More than the land itself. She thought about that. She thought about men who rode past her fence at odd hours, and legal letters, and a county official with a particular smile. She thought about how the Harmon Syndicate had been happy enough to pressure a widow with 2 children over 140 acres of grazing land. Water was a different category of thing entirely. They'll find out, she said. Eventually, he agreed. When they do, it'll get worse before it gets better. She looked at him across the table. You knew this when you agreed yesterday. He met her eyes. I knew there was a possibility. That's not a no. No, he said. It's not. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked down at her coffee and breathed out slowly through her nose. All right, she said. All right, he said. Outside, the first pale light was beginning to show over the eastern ridge, pink and uncertain, pushing against the dark. Tommy's voice drifted down from upstairs. He was already awake, already moving, already beginning the particular kind of morning energy that had exhausted everyone around him since he was about 3 years old. Mara stood up and went to make breakfast. In the weeks that followed, Black Hollow talked. It talked the way small towns always talk, in fragments and speculation, layered with assumption, filtered through the particular biases of everyone doing the talking. Some people said Cade Mercer had taken leave of his senses. Some said the widow must have had something on him, some leverage or secret, because no sensible man would marry a stranger with 2 children and a land dispute in the space of an afternoon without some kind of hidden motive. Some people, fewer, but they existed, said Cade Mercer had always been the kind of man who made decisions other people didn't understand, and that was precisely why he had more land and more cattle than any of them. Mara heard fragments of it when she came into town for supplies. She ignored what she could and responded to the rest with the particular brevity that, she had found, communicated more than detailed arguments ever did. She was in the general store one afternoon, 2 weeks after arriving, when she overheard 2 women discussing her in the aisle over from where she was examining fabric. Heard she manipulated him somehow. You know how some women can... Those poor children, going from one dead father to... Mara set the fabric bolt down carefully and walked around the end of the aisle. The 2 women saw her and went quiet with the particular guilt of people who had not expected to be overheard. Mara looked at them steadily. She recognized both of them. She'd been introduced to them at the general store counter her first week, names already associated with their faces. Mrs. Prescott, she said. Mrs. Fenn. She paused. My children are not poor, and they're not to be pitied. They are healthy and fed and sleeping under a solid roof, and I would ask that you treat them as children deserve to be treated, which is with ordinary human decency rather than as the subject of your concern. Another pause. The same, if you don't mind, goes for me. She picked up her basket and went to the counter. Neither woman said anything. She did not feel triumphant about it. She felt tired and a little sick with it, the way you feel when you've done something that needed to be done but cost you more than it should have. But she kept her face level and paid for her supplies and walked out. Kate had been watching her more carefully than she realized. She understood this gradually in small observations, the way he adjusted the schedule of the ranch hands to make sure someone was always visible on the property, the way he had quietly, without mentioning it, begun keeping her informed of things he heard in town. A rider seen near the east fence, a letter he'd received from a Helena lawyer he knew, flagging something about a new land survey company that had recently set up in the area. He didn't make a production of any of it. He mentioned things the way you mention weather or the state of the fences, as information relevant to someone who needed to know. She found it both reassuring and, in a way she hadn't expected, disorienting. She had managed her own affairs since she was 19. Her first husband had been kind but sick from the beginning, and that marriage had required her to be competent in ways that most people in her situation weren't forced to be. Jacob had been different, a real partner, someone she'd built things with. But his death had stripped away that architecture so completely and so suddenly that she'd had no time to mourn it before she had to start being competent, alone again. Having someone share information with her, adjust their plans to account for her situation, pay attention to her circumstances. It felt unfamiliar in a way that she didn't entirely know what to do with. One evening, coming in from the barn where she'd been checking on a horse Ellie had taken a particular interest in, she found Cade on the porch looking at something in the distance. She followed his gaze, the ridge to the north, the line where the land she legally owned met the sky. What are you looking at? She asked. Smoke, he said. She looked again. There, very faint, against the darkening gray of the evening sky, a thread of it. Campfire? She said. Maybe. He didn't move. Or somebody making sure I know they're there. She looked at the smoke for a long moment. Then she looked at him. They won't wait much longer, she said. It wasn't a question. He glanced sideways at her. No, when they figure out the water situation, and they will, they won't wait. Then we'd better be ready before they figure it out. He was quiet for a moment, then something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, not anywhere near it, but something. You're not what I expected, he said. What did you expect? Someone more frightened. She looked at him. I'm frightened, she said. I'm frightened every single day. I just don't have the luxury of letting it make my decisions for me. He looked at her steadily, and she held the look. And for a moment the space between them had a quality that was different from the careful politeness of the previous weeks. Not warm, not yet. but not entirely cold either. Then Tommy's voice erupted from somewhere inside the house, followed by Ellie's answering shriek, followed by the particular crash of something being knocked over that Mara recognized as the sound of her son doing something she would need to address. She turned and went inside. Cade stayed on the porch, watching the smoke. That night, after the children were in bed and Mrs. Aldridge had gone to her room and the house had gone quiet, Mara sat at the kitchen table with the deed in her hands. She had read it many times. She knew the legal language well enough to cite it from memory, but she read it again because reading it reminded her of what this was about, underneath everything else. The children's voices upstairs, the sound of the wind on the ridge, the thin thread of smoke against the darkening sky. 140 acres, her children's future. Jacob had died for it. Not dramatically, not in a firefight or a sudden act of violence. He had died of what the doctor called a respiratory illness. Though Mara had always believed the months of pressure and harassment and worry had taken the real toll, had ground him down in ways that left him open to the illness that finished the work. He had died in February, 3 months after the first legal letter arrived, and Mara had buried him in frozen ground and then sat in her kitchen for 2 days trying to figure out what to do next. This was what she had come up with. She folded the deed and put it back in her satchel, next to the marriage certificate, next to the $43, next to the photograph of a man she had loved. She put out the lamp. She went upstairs. At the top of the stairs, she paused. Down the hall, she could see the thin line of light under Cade's door. He was still up, which was not unusual. She stood there for a moment in the dark, listening to the house breathe around her. Whatever this was, this strange, practical, too-fast arrangement, this life built on a crisis rather than any ordinary beginning, it was what she had. She had not come to Black Hollow for a love story. She had come for something more fundamental than that. She had come to survive. And in the weeks since she'd arrived, she had begun, cautiously and without making too much of it, to believe that she might actually do it. She went to her room. The wind came down off the ridge and moved around the corners of the house, and somewhere in the distance, cattle settled for the night, and the Montana dark closed in around Mercer Ranch like a hand closing around something fragile, holding it carefully, not yet sure what it was holding. The first hard frost came in the second week of October, earlier than anyone in Black Hollow had expected, and it killed the last of the garden that Mrs. Aldridge had been nursing along the south side of the house. She discovered it at dawn and said nothing about it, just pulled up the blackened stems with a grim efficiency that communicated everything. Mara watched from the kitchen window and understood, without being told, that the growing season was over. It felt like a verdict on something, though she couldn't have said exactly what. Life at Mercer Ranch had settled into a shape over the preceding weeks. Not comfortable, not yet, but functional. Mara had taken over the household accounts, which Mrs. Aldridge surrendered with something that might have been relief, managing a ledger that was organized but hadn't been updated consistently in months. She had cataloged the pantry, learned which of the ranch hands were reliable and which needed watching, established a routine for the children that kept them occupied without driving everyone around them to exhaustion. Tommy had latched on to Garrett, the young, freckle-faced hand, with the tenacity of a child who has identified someone willing to answer his questions. Within a week, Garrett was teaching him to saddle a horse, which Mara had permitted with specific conditions. Supervised, inside the corral, nothing that moved too fast. Ellie was quieter about her adjustments, as she was quiet about most things, but Mara had found her twice sitting on the porch steps in the early morning, watching the ridge with the same patient attention she gave everything. And once, just once, she had found Ellie standing in the kitchen doorway, watching Cade read at the table, studying him with those serious eyes, before Mara drew her gently away. The arrangement with Cade was what it was. They ate dinner together most evenings because the kitchen was the kitchen and there was no logical reason to do otherwise. They talked about practical things, the ranch, the weather, the children, the slow-moving business of the land records. He was not a warm man, not in the easy surface way that some people manage to be warm regardless of circumstance. But he was consistent, and she had come to believe that consistency, in a person, was worth more than warmth. She had also noticed that he listened when she spoke, which was not something she took for granted. It was on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after their arrival, that Cade came in from a ride looking like something had gone wrong. Not dramatically. He didn't slam doors or raise his voice or do anything that announced itself. He just came into the kitchen with mud on his coat and a particular set to his jaw that she had begun to recognize as his version of controlled agitation. He poured himself water from the pitcher and drank half of it standing at the sink. "What happened?" Mara said. "East fence, 3 sections down." He set the cup on the counter. "Not from weather." She looked at him. "Cut?" "Cut. Cleanly. And the cattle in that pasture moved. Somebody pushed them west overnight, away from the boundary." She thought about what that meant. Somebody had gone to the trouble of not just damaging property, but of moving cattle away from the damage, which was the kind of careful, methodical action that signaled organization rather than random hostility. "The survey," she said. He nodded once. "Somebody knows something. Or suspects." She sat down at the table. "The land office. When I filed the additional documentation last month, who would have seen it?" "Alderman handles records. His clerk has access." He turned from the sink and leaned against the counter, arms crossed, looking at the floor. "There are 2 men on the county land board who I know have dealings with the Harmon Syndicate. If either of them got wind of what the old survey shows, they'd move. They'd move." Mara pressed her hands flat on the table. She thought about the threat of smoke on the ridge 3 weeks ago. She thought about Jacob's face in the months before he died, the way it had become thin and watchful, the weight of being slowly cornered settling on him like something physical. She was not going to be cornered. "How long to repair the fence?" she said. 2 days? Maybe 3 if the weather turns. "Then we repair it." She looked at him. "And I want to look at that survey again tonight. The water boundary. If there's a legal filing we can make before they do, something that puts it on official record first." "I was thinking the same thing." He pushed off the counter. "I need to ride out again. I'll be back before dark." He was. He came back bruised. She saw it when he came through the door. The way he held his left arm slightly differently, the tension around his mouth. He dropped into a chair at the kitchen table and pulled off his hat, and there was a cut along his cheekbone that had dried into a dark line. Mara looked at it. She didn't say anything dramatic. She went to get water and cloth. "What happened?" she said, sitting across from him, beginning to clean the cut without asking his permission, because asking his permission would have been a waste of time she didn't have. He let her. That told her something. 2 men on the north road, riding in the same direction as me for about a mile before they made it clear they had something to say. Did they? In their way? He was very still while she worked, which she appreciated. "They said the Clearwater parcel was going to change hands before winter. Said I'd done myself a disservice by getting involved in something that didn't concern me." She stopped for a moment. "Those were their words? That it didn't concern you?" "More or less. You told them it concerned you." "I told them a few things." He paused. The conversation ended when they decided it wasn't worth continuing. She looked at the cut again. It had been made by something. A fist, a ring, maybe a fall from a horse if things had gotten physical enough for that. She cleaned it as carefully as she could and pressed a cloth against it. "You could have been more seriously hurt," she said. "Yes." "That doesn't concern you." He looked at her directly, which he did often. He was not the kind of man who looked away from things. "I've been in worse situations." "That's not an answer. It's the answer I have." He reached up and held the cloth against his own cheek, and she moved her hand, and for a moment their fingers were in approximately the same place, and then they weren't. "I need you to understand something, Mara." She had not heard him use her name before. Not by itself. Without the Mrs., it landed differently than she expected. "What?" she said. "When I agreed to this arrangement, I agreed to it completely. Not halfway. Not until it got inconvenient." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not going to stand back and let them take what's yours because the alternative requires me to be uncomfortable. That's not who I am." She held his gaze for a long moment. Something in her chest was doing something she didn't fully want to examine. "All right," she said. "Then we do this properly." He nodded once. She got up, went to where her satchel hung by the door, and pulled out the deed and the survey notes and brought them back to the table. She spread them out. He leaned forward despite the cut, despite whatever had happened on the North Road, and looked at the papers with the focused attention of a man who was genuinely interested in solving the problem in front of him. They worked at that table until Mrs. Aldridge came down and told them both, in her direct way, that it was past midnight and that whatever it was could wait until morning. Bosik, The filing went to the land office 4 days later. Mara did it herself. She had written the document with Cade's help. He knew the legal language better than she would have expected, which she supposed she shouldn't have been surprised by. A man who had accumulated the land and business interests he had, and she had walked into Alderman's office and set it on his desk and watched his face as he read it. Alderman was a careful man. His face gave away very little, but there was a pause, just a beat too long, when he reached the section about the creek boundary, and Mara read that pause the way she read most things, accurately. "I'll need to verify this against the original survey," he said. "Of course," Mara said. "Here's a copy of the 1871 document. I'd appreciate confirmation in writing once the verification is complete." He looked at her over his spectacles. "This could take some time." "I understand." She kept her voice level. "I have time." She did not have time, but she was not going to tell him that. Walking back down the main street of Black Hollow, with the receipt for her filing folded in her satchel, she felt the town watching her in its sideways way. Conversations adjusting, eyes sliding away from direct contact. It was different from the curiosity of her first week. It had an edge to it now. People in small places always know when something is happening, even when they don't know the specifics, and the specifics had a way of finding their way out regardless. At the general store, she bought coffee and flour and the penny candy that Tommy had requested with a persistence that had eventually worn her down. The man behind the counter, a different one than usual, someone she didn't recognize, took her money without meeting her eyes. As she was leaving, a hand touched her arm. She turned. A woman she'd seen at the church, she hadn't attended, but she'd seen the congregation on Sunday mornings, stood close, face carefully arranged. "Mrs. Mercer," the woman said quietly, "you should know there are men in town today from the Harmon Company. I don't know why, but 3 of them rode in this morning, and they went straight to the land office." Mara looked at her. The woman's expression was not particularly warm, but it was genuine, the look of someone passing on information because it seemed like the right thing to do. "Thank you," Mara said. She kept her pace steady, walking back to where she'd left the wagon. She did not run. Running communicated things she had no interest in communicating. She drove back to the ranch and found Cade in the barn. "There were Harmon men at the land office this morning," she said. 3 of them. He set down the piece of harness he'd been working on. "After you left or before?" "After, according to someone who saw them." "Then they saw your filing. Aldermen would have been required to show them. If they have any standing request for records—" She stopped. "It's going to move faster now." He stood up and looked at her. In the dim barn light with the smell of hay and horses around them, his face was serious and settled, the kind of face that had made its calculations and wasn't going to be rattled by the results. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. And the repetition of that between them, that particular exchange they kept returning to, that practical acknowledgement of difficult things, had started to feel like its own language. That night at dinner, Tommy talked the entire meal about something Garrett had shown him about reading cattle by their body language, animating the conversation with his hands in a way that sent Ellie into barely suppressed laughter beside him. Mara ate and watched them and felt something split in her chest, the genuine, uncomplicated pleasure of watching her children be children, and underneath it, the cold awareness of everything that was moving against them in rooms she wasn't in. She looked up and found Cade watching the children too. His expression was the unreadable one he often wore, but there was something behind it that she couldn't quite name. Not tenderness, not exactly, but something that wasn't indifference either. He caught her looking and held her gaze for a moment, and then Tommy said something that required a response, and the moment passed. After the children were in bed, she came back downstairs to find him at the table with a letter in his hand. "This came this afternoon," he said. "I should have mentioned it earlier." She took it. The return address was a legal firm in Helena she didn't recognize. Inside, the language was dense and formally hostile. It referenced a disputed boundary, questioned the validity of the 1871 survey document, and made oblique references to legal challenges pending in the territorial court. At the bottom, a name she did recognize, Harmon Land and Cattle Company. She read it twice. "They're moving through the courts," she said. "That's the opening move. It's slower, but it's safer for them. They get to make you spend money and time defending something while they apply pressure on the ground simultaneously." He leaned back. I've dealt with this approach before. On your own land? Years ago. Different situation. He paused. Same tactic. She set the letter on the table. What did you do? He was quiet for a moment. I made it unprofitable to continue. Found the point where pressing the case would cost them more than backing off. He looked at the letter. The water rights changed the math. That creek access is worth enough that they can't just absorb the cost of losing it, which means they're going to push harder, but it also means they're more exposed. Because they have more to lose. Because they have more to lose, he agreed. Mara looked at the letter on the table. Then she looked at him. You've been managing this situation with more sophistication than I gave you credit for initially. He seemed slightly surprised by that. Not offended, just caught off guard. What did you give me credit for initially? Being a large, powerful presence that my enemies would find daunting, she said honestly. He almost smiled. It was the closest she had seen him come to it, a slight shift at the corner of his mouth, there and gone. That's part of it. What's the other part? The same thing you're doing, he said, not giving them an inch. She held his gaze. The lamp was burning low on the table between them, throwing warm, unsteady light across the papers and the letter, and his hands resting on the table edge. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the window frames in their way. I need you to do something, he said. Something you're not going to like. Tell me. I want to put your name on the livestock records and on the property dealings for Mercer Ranch. She stared at him. That's your operation, your business. Yes. He met her eyes. And if your name is beside mine on those records, officially, it sends a message to anyone who thinks they can separate you from this situation. They can't go after the Calloway widow and leave Mercer Ranch untouched. It becomes the same thing. She understood what he was saying. He was proposing to make himself financially and legally entangled with her in a way that went well beyond what any practical arrangement required. He was proposing to make her situation his situation in a way that couldn't be easily undone. That's not a small thing, she said. No, he agreed. If this goes wrong, if they find a judge who'll entertain the territorial challenge, if the legal fight gets expensive, I'm aware of what it means. Cade, she said his name deliberately, I came to you for protection of a specific kind, not for you to absorb the full weight of something that started as my problem. He looked at her for a long moment. There was something careful and precise in his eyes, the way there was when he was about to say something he'd thought about more than he was going to let on. It stopped being only your problem, he said, about 2 weeks after you arrived. She didn't say anything. He reached across the table and pulled the livestock ledger toward him, opened it to the current page, and set it in front of her with a pen. She looked at the ledger. She looked at him. Then she picked up the pen and wrote her name. Bab. October deepened toward November and the cold came in earnest. Not the tentative frost of early month, but the real thing, the kind that put ice on the water troughs before sunrise and turned the ground iron hard by mid-morning. The cattle moved down from the high pasture, and the hands worked long days to get them settled in the lower fields before the first real snow. Mara worked alongside the household management, the accounts, the filing of additional documents that her correspondence with a lawyer in Billings, Cade's recommendation, a man named Forsyth who was capable and direct and charged a reasonable rate, had generated. She wrote letters. She reviewed documents. She learned more about territorial land law in 2 months than she had in her previous 24 years combined. And between all of it, life continued in the strange, improbable way that life does. Ellie had quietly adopted one of the barn cats, a grizzled orange tom who tolerated her attentions with the resigned dignity of an animal that has run out of avenues of escape. She named him Captain, for reasons she couldn't fully explain, and he appeared at the kitchen door most mornings and was fed scraps that Mrs. Aldridge officially disapproved of and unofficially provided. Tommy had graduated from the corral to supervised rides in the lower pasture, seated in front of Garrett on a calm mare named Biscuit, his back straight and his face wearing the expression of someone trying very hard to look like they had been doing this for years. Mara watched from the fence one afternoon and felt the specific bittersweet quality of watching your child discover a version of themselves you hadn't met yet. Cade noticed her watching. He had come to stand beside her at the fence, and they watched Tommy and Garrett make a slow loop around the pasture, and neither of them said anything for a while. "He's not afraid," Cade said finally. "No, Mara said. He's reckless, which is different, and I spend a significant amount of energy distinguishing between the two. His father was like that? She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the pasture, not at her, which made the question feel less like an intrusion than it might have. Jacob was careful, she said. Very careful. Tommy gets the reckless from me, I think, which I have complicated feelings about. You're not reckless, Cade said. I married a stranger in an afternoon to outmaneuver a land syndicate, she said. He was quiet for a moment. That's not reckless. That's calculated. It was both, she said honestly. Most decisions are. He turned to look at her then, and she met his eyes, and there was a quality to the moment that she had started to recognize. These occasional spaces in their pragmatic daily exchange, where something less pragmatic moved underneath the surface, like cold water under ice. She was aware of it, and she was careful with it, because careful was what the situation required, and also because she was genuinely not sure what she wanted from it. She turned back to the pasture before she had to figure that out. Garrett's good with him, she said. Good hand, Kate agreed. He's going to want his own place eventually. He's that type. He paused. I know the type. I was the type. She looked at him. He rarely offered things like that, small, voluntary pieces of himself. Where did you come from? Before this? East of here, small place, nothing like this. He looked at the horizon in the way he did when he was deciding how much to say. Left when I was 17, worked cattle drives for a few years, saved what I could, bought land when land was cheaper. That's the short version, Mara said. It's the version I have. She didn't push. She understood the value of the short version, the way it kept the parts you weren't ready to talk about safely compressed. She had her own short version. 2 marriages, 2 losses, 2 children, 1 land deed. Everything else was a detail. But she thought about what it meant. A 17-year-old who had left everything familiar, worked years of hard labor, built something from nothing in a territory that offered no guarantees and no forgiveness for mistakes. She thought about the choices that required and the person it produced, and she thought she understood him a little better than she had a month ago. A week later, the wire came. Forsyth, the Billings lawyer, sent a telegram that Garrett brought out from town. The Harmon Syndicate had filed a formal legal challenge to the 1871 survey in the territorial court. The case was assigned to a circuit judge who would hear arguments in the spring. In the meantime, the filing created a legal cloud over the water rights that meant neither party could act on them. It was not unexpected. Mara read the telegram at the kitchen table, with Cade standing across from her, and felt the particular compression of someone receiving news they had already half prepared for. Spring, she said. That's their intention. They'll let it sit over winter, let you spend money on legal fees, let the uncertainty wear on you. He leaned against the doorframe. They'll also make other moves in the meantime. She set the telegram down. What kind of other moves? Anything that makes staying here harder. Anything that makes you consider whether the fight is worth the cost. He paused. They'll come at you through whatever they think is your weak point. She thought about that. They don't know me. No, but they'll look. 2 days later, she understood what he meant. A man arrived at the ranch, not with weapons or threats, but with a calling card and a professionally sympathetic smile. He said his name was Mr. Callow, that he represented a group of concerned individuals who had interests in the region, and that he was there to make a sincere offer for the Clearwater parcel, for cash, at a fair price, no legal conflict necessary. Mara met him on the porch. She did not invite him in. How much? She said. He named a number. It was not insulting. It was actually reasonable, probably close to what the land was worth on the surface, without considering the water rights. No, she said. He adjusted his smile with the practiced flexibility of a man who had done this before. Mrs. Mercer, I understand the legal situation may feel complicated, but a cash settlement would remove my children's inheritance and reward the people who made the last 3 months of my life a particular kind of difficult, Mara said. The answer is no, Mr. Callow. If you'd like to leave a written offer for my lawyer to review, you're welcome to do that, but the answer is still going to be no. He looked at her. The smile had developed a brittle quality. The legal process can be very costly, he said, very time-consuming. A settlement avoids all of that. I'm aware of what the legal process involves, Mara said. Good day. She went inside and closed the door and stood in the hallway for a moment with her back against it, breathing slowly. Mrs. Aldridge appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at the closed door and then at Mara. "Harmon man," she said. "Harmon man," Mara confirmed. Mrs. Aldridge made a sound in the back of her throat that communicated, without words, everything she thought about that. Then she went back to the kitchen. Cade had been in the barn. When he came in that evening and Mara told him what had happened, his expression went through something. She was getting better at reading those small shifts, the ones that meant more than they showed, and then settled back into its usual controlled stillness. "You handled it right," he said. "I know," she said. "Not with arrogance, just the flat certainty of someone who has made a decision they're at peace with." He looked at her across the kitchen table, and something passed between them. The particular acknowledgement of two people who are fighting the same thing and have each, separately, arrived at the same answer. "I want to ride the fence line tomorrow," she said. "The east boundary. I want to see it myself." "That's not a comfortable ride." "I know. The ground's frozen hard." "I know that too." He looked at her steadily. "All right, I'll go with you." She almost said she didn't need him to come with her, and then she stopped because that would have been stubborn to the point of stupidity, and she was a great many things, but she tried not to be stupid. "Early," she said, "before the light changes. I'll have the horses ready." She nodded. She got up to check on the children, and as she passed the window, she saw the first real snow of the season beginning to fall. Not the tentative flurries of October, but the real thing, heavy and purposeful, coming down in the dark outside the glass like a decision being made about everything. She stopped and watched it for a moment. The snow kept falling. The lamp burned on the table. Somewhere above her, Tommy laughed at something his sister said, and the sound of it moved through the house like heat. She watched the snow and thought about spring, when the judge would hear arguments, when the Harmon Syndicate would put their case before a man she'd never met in a room she'd never seen, and everything she'd come to Black Hollow to protect would either hold or give way. Winter was just beginning. There was a long way still to go. The new survey arrived on a Tuesday in late November, delivered by a territorial assessor who rode out from Black Hollow with his coat buttoned to his chin and the particular apologetic manner of a man carrying news he didn't write but was obligated to deliver. He spread the documents on the kitchen table, pointed to the relevant sections with a gloved finger, and explained in careful language what the new measurements confirmed. The Clearwater parcel extended further west than the current boundary markers showed, by approximately 400 yards. And in that 400 yards, running along a shallow depression that filled with snowmelt each spring, was the eastern branch of Clearwater Creek. The water rights were not a possibility. They were a fact, documented now on official paper with the territorial seal at the bottom. Mara looked at the survey for a long time after the assessor left. Cade stood at the window with his arms crossed and said nothing, which was how she knew he understood exactly what this meant. "How long before Harmon's people see this?" she said. "They may already know. The assessor's office doesn't seal its records." He turned from the window. "If they didn't understand what they were dealing with before, they do now. Then everything accelerates." "Yes." She folded her hands on the table. Outside, the sky was the flat white of incoming snow, the kind that settled in and stayed. The children were at the kitchen table doing their lessons. Mrs. Aldridge had taken it upon herself to structure their mornings, which Mara was grateful for in ways she hadn't fully expressed. And the sound of Tommy's pencil scraping across his slate made the kitchen feel for a moment deceptively ordinary. "I want to walk the boundary," Mara said, "before anything else happens. I want to stand on that land and know exactly what we're talking about." Cade looked at her. "The ground's frozen solid." "I know. It's 4 miles from the nearest point on the Clearwater parcel to where the creek runs. Then we ride 4 miles. He was quiet for a beat. "Tomorrow, weather permitting." The weather did not permit. It snowed through Wednesday and most of Thursday, the kind of heavy, windless snow that muffled sound and turned the ranch into a series of white shapes with smoke rising from them. Garrett and the other hands worked to keep the cattle from drifting and to break the ice on the water troughs twice a day. Mrs. Aldridge made soup and bread and said little. The children went slightly feral from being inside too long, and Mara spent a portion of Thursday afternoon mediating a dispute between Tommy and Ellie about something so trivial she had already forgotten what it was by evening. The letter came Friday morning. It was addressed to Cade, not to her, which was a calculation she recognized immediately. Whoever had sent it understood that sending it to her directly acknowledged her standing in the matter, and they were not ready to do that. It came from the same Helena legal firm as before, but the language had changed. The earlier letter had been oblique and procedural. This one was direct. It stated that the Harmon Land and Cattle Company disputed the validity of the new survey, that they had engaged their own assessor, that they intended to file an emergency motion with the territorial court to freeze any action on the disputed boundary pending full adjudication, and that any attempt by either party to establish physical presence at the disputed boundary prior to the court's ruling would be treated as an act of aggression and addressed accordingly. Addressed accordingly, Mara said, reading it aloud at the table that evening. That's the part worth noting, Cade said. It's a threat. It's a threat dressed as a legal position. The two aren't mutually exclusive. He took the letter back and read it again. They've moved the timeline. If they get an emergency motion granted, the court could freeze everything for months, maybe longer. Can they get it granted? Forsyth says there's a judge in the territorial court who has ties to the Harmon Group. If the case gets assigned to him, he set the letter down. Yes, they might. Mara stared at the letter on the table. She had understood from the beginning that this would be a fight, that the Harmon Syndicate had resources and connections she couldn't match dollar for dollar or favor for favor. She had understood that the shape of this battle was going to be determined by where she chose to be immovable, because she couldn't be immovable everywhere. She had known all of this. But there was a difference between knowing a thing and sitting across from the paper evidence of it on a Friday night with snow on the ground and two children asleep upstairs. There's something else, Cade said. She looked at him. I heard something in town today while the survey was being filed, from a man named Pruitt. He used to ride with me years ago before he settled near the valley. He's not a man who talks without a reason. He paused. He told me there are 4 armed riders who've been camping in the tree line on the north side of the Clearwater parcel for the past week, taking shifts, watching the fence line. The kitchen was very quiet. That's not a legal strategy, Mara said. No, Cade said. It's not. They're prepared to use force. They're prepared to threaten it, which is usually enough. He looked at her carefully. For most people. She understood what he wasn't saying. Most people, faced with armed riders and a hostile legal challenge and the accumulated pressure of months, made the calculation that the land wasn't worth it. Most people took the settlement offer. Most people found a way to make peace with the loss because the alternative was too large and too dangerous. She thought about Jacob, not about his face or his voice, but about the specific quality of his belief in that land. The way he had talked about what it could be, what it could mean for their children's lives. He had believed it so hard and for so long that it had cost him everything. She was not going to let that cost be for nothing. I want to go to the boundary tomorrow, she said. Survey or not, letter or not. I want to stand there. Cade looked at her for a long moment. If those riders are still there, then they'll see that I'm not going anywhere. She held his gaze. I'm not asking you to come. I know you're not. But you're going to. Yes, he said. I am. They rode out before sunrise. The cold was the kind that worked its way through every layer and settled in the bones. The kind of cold that Montana produced in late November as a matter of principle. The horses moved carefully over the frozen ground, breath coming in clouds, and the land around them was white and silent and flat in the pre-dawn gray. Garrett came as well, and a hand named Donovan, who had been with Cade for 7 years and had the calm, unhurried manner of someone who had been in difficult situations before and found them manageable. Nobody talked much on the ride. There wasn't a lot to say. They reached the east boundary of the Clearwater parcel as the sky began to lighten. Not sunrise, not yet, but that preliminary brightness that comes before it, turning the snow blue-white and the shadows long. Mara could see the old boundary markers, the wooden stakes that had been set in better weather, several of them listing to one side where the ground had heaved in the freeze, and beyond the markers, in the tree line to the north, she could see them, 2 horses. 2 men, visible as dark shapes against the white, sitting their mounts and watching. She stopped her horse and looked at them. They looked back. There's more, Cade said quietly beside her. East of the trees. I count at least 2 more. 4 total, she said, like Pruitt said. Like Pruitt said. She sat her horse at the boundary line and looked at the land that was hers, by document and deed, and the death of a man who had believed in it, and she felt something settle in her. Not calm, not peace, but something colder and more durable than either. The kind of certainty that comes when you have been pushed as far as you intend to go and have turned around to face whatever's behind you. I'm not leaving, she said. Not to Cade, not to anyone in particular, just saying it to the frozen air and the watching men in the tree line and the land itself. She walked her horse forward, past the boundary markers, onto the disputed ground. Behind her, she heard Cade's horse follow. Then Garrett. Then Donovan. The riders in the tree line didn't move. They watched. One of them said something to the other, too far away to hear. Neither of them came forward. Mara rode to the northwest corner of the parcel, where the survey said the creek ran. Under the snow, she could see the slight depression of it, the way the ground dipped, the way the willows along the bank still held their skeletal shapes above the white. She stopped there and looked at it. 400 yards of frozen ground, and underneath it, water that would run again in spring. She stayed there for a long time, long enough for the cold to really establish itself in her hands and her feet, long enough for the light to fully arrive, long enough for the men in the tree line to understand that she was not going to be uncomfortable enough to leave. Eventually, one of them rode toward her. He stopped 20 feet out, a heavy-set man, mid-40s, with a sheepskin coat and the kind of expression that was trying to communicate authority but had some uncertainty underneath it. He looked at Mara, then at Cade, then back at Mara. "You're on disputed land," he said. "I'm on my land," Mara said. "The court hasn't ruled on that. The territorial assessor has. The 1871 survey has. My deed has." She looked at him steadily. "A court ruling doesn't create my ownership. It confirms what's already documented." The man shifted in his saddle. "The Harmon Company has a contrary position. The Harmon Company can present their contrary position to the circuit judge in the spring." She kept her voice even. "In the meantime, I'd like to know on whose authority 4 armed men are camped in the tree line on the edge of my property." He didn't answer that directly, which was answer enough. "Ma'am," he said, and the word carried a particular kind of condescension that she had been receiving from various men for most of her adult life. "The situation is more complicated than—" "It's not complicated at all," Cade said. His voice was quiet, and it was the voice he used when he was being very precise about something, and the effect it had on the heavy-set man was immediate and visible. He turned to look at Cade with the expression of someone who has just remembered something they would have preferred to forget. "Mr. Mercer," he said. "Those 4 men need to move off," Cade said. "Today. And I'd recommend you pass that along to whoever you're reporting to, along with this. The next time I find armed riders in a tree line watching my wife on her own land, I'm going to treat it as a threat to her safety and respond to it as such." The heavy-set man looked at him. He looked at Mara. He looked at Garrett and Donovan behind them. "I'll pass it along," he said. He rode back to the tree line. Within 20 minutes, all 4 riders had gone. Mara watched them disappear into the trees and felt no triumph about it. They would be back, or different men would. The withdrawal was tactical, not genuine. But for today on this frozen ground, she was standing on her land and they were not. She turned her horse and looked at Cade. "Thank you," she said. "I didn't do much," he said. "You were here." He met her eyes, and something moved through his expression. Not the controlled stillness she was used to, but something less managed, something that had been sitting under the surface of all their careful practicality for weeks. "Let's go back," he said. "The cold's getting serious." She nodded. They turned the horses toward home. Pruitt came to the ranch 3 days later. He was a lean, weathered man in his 50s with a gray beard and the careful eyes of someone who had spent a lot of years paying attention to his surroundings. Mara had never met him, but she understood immediately why Cade trusted him. There was nothing theatrical about him, nothing that suggested he had any investment in being impressive. He was simply there, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, delivering information. "They know about the confrontation at the boundary," Pruitt said. "The man you spoke to, Kelch, reported back. The Harmon people aren't happy." He turned his cup in his hands. "There's talk of escalating." "What kind of talk?" Cade said. The kind that happens when men who are used to getting what they want realize they might not. Pruitt glanced at Mara briefly, not dismissively, just the glance of a man deciding how direct to be with a woman he didn't know well. She returned the look steadily, and he appeared to decide. They're talking about making the property itself untenable. Not legal pressure, physical. The fences, Mara said. Fences, water access, outbuildings, if they're willing to go that far, sir. He paused. There's also talk about the children. The kitchen went very still. What talk? Mara said, and her voice came out completely flat, which was what happened when the thing she was most afraid of was mentioned directly. Nothing specific, nothing violent. Pruitt said it quickly, reading her correctly. More the idea that a woman with 2 young children is a different calculation than a woman without them, that her decisions are limited by what she's responsible for. He looked uncomfortable saying it. I'm telling you because you need to know it's part of their thinking. They'll look for a way to use them as leverage without touching them. Mara sat with that for a moment. She thought about Tommy on his horse in the lower pasture, all confidence and borrowed competence. She thought about Ellie with her serious eyes and her barn cat, watching the world with the careful attention of a child who had already learned that the world required watching. She thought about what it meant that men in a room somewhere had looked at her children and seen a weakness. They won't find one, she said. Her voice was still flat. The children stay inside from now on unless there's someone with them, Garrett or Donovan. Not alone in the yard. She looked at Cade. I want to know who's coming up the road before they get to the house. He nodded once. I'll set a watch rotation. And I want a rights to Forsyth today. If they move against the property, any of it, I want it documented immediately as violation of the legal status quo while the case is pending. If they're willing to act while a court case is open, that tells the judge something about their character. Pruitt looked at her with a slight adjustment in his expression. You've thought about this more than I expected. I've been thinking about nothing else for 4 months, she said. After Pruitt left, Mara sat at the table alone for a few minutes while Cade walked him out. She put her hands flat on the wood and breathed slowly. The fear was real. She was not going to pretend it wasn't, not even to herself. There was a version of this situation that ended very badly, that ended with everything she had come here to protect scattered and lost. She knew that. She kept that knowledge in a specific place in her mind, accessible but not in front, because if she let it in front, she would make small decisions and cautious decisions, and the kind of decisions that kept you safe in the moment and destroyed you in the long run. She moved it back where it belonged. Cade came back in. He stood for a moment just inside the door looking at her. You all right? He said. She looked at him. There it was again, that careful attention he paid her. Not hovering, not excessive, just the genuine inquiry of someone who wanted an honest answer. No, she said. Not entirely. She held his gaze. But I'm all right enough. He nodded. He sat down across from her. He didn't try to reassure her or tell her it would be fine, which she appreciated deeply, because she was tired of people telling her things would be fine when they had no particular basis for the claim. The watch rotation, she said. Can Donovan manage the night side? Yes, I'll take the ridge view myself early morning. You're not sleeping enough as it is. He looked at her. Something flickered. I'm fine. You've been up before 4 every morning for the past 2 weeks. So have you. She almost said something else, and then didn't, because the conversation had developed a quality that was not entirely practical anymore, and she wasn't sure she was ready for what came after practical. All right, she said instead. All right, he said. The storm came on a Sunday night without much warning. The sky had been overcast for 2 days, which was ordinary, and the temperature had been dropping, which was also ordinary in late November in Montana, and so nobody read the particular combination of those things as correctly as they should have. By the time the wind picked up properly, it was already dark, and by midnight the snow was coming sideways at a velocity that made the window glass flex in its frames. Mara was awake when it started. She had been awake for an hour already, reading by lamplight, unable to settle. She heard the wind pick up and went to the window and looked out at nothing, just white and dark and movement. She could not see the barn from the window. She got dressed. Cade was already in the kitchen when she came down. He had his coat on and was lacing his boots. The cattle, she said. The fence on the north side was already stressed. If it goes in this wind, they'll drift. He stood up. I need Donovan and Garrett. I'll get Donovan. He's in the bunkhouse. He looked at her. The weather is genuinely dangerous. I know what the weather is, she said. She pulled her coat from the peg. And you need more than 2 people if the fence is down. They went out into it. The cold hit like something solid, the wind driving the snow horizontally so that every step required deliberate effort. Mara got to the bunkhouse and hammered on the door until Donovan appeared, and within minutes he and Garrett were dressed and out. They worked for 3 hours in that storm. The north fence had not gone entirely. 2 sections weakened, 1 post sheared off at the base. But the cattle had pushed against it in their instinct to move away from the wind, and the situation could have been significantly worse. They drove the animals back, repaired the worst of the damage with materials from the barn, worked in rotating pairs so that nobody was in the wind alone for too long. It was during the second hour that Mara, coming around the corner of the barn with a coil of wire, nearly collided with Cade coming the other direction. He caught her by both arms to keep her from going down on the ice. For a moment they were very close in the dark and the noise of the storm, his hands on her arms, her face turned up toward his. The wind was doing something terrible to everything around them. His face was close and covered in snow, and his expression had lost its usual management entirely. He just looked at her with something that was not complicated at all. Then he said, into the wind, "All right?" "Yes," she said. He let go. They went back to work. It was nearly 4 in the morning when they came inside. Mrs. Aldridge had apparently woken at some point and, rather than waking the children, had put a pot on the stove, and there was hot coffee and something that had once been a loaf of bread transformed into toast. Nobody said much. They sat in the kitchen damp and cold and worn through and drank coffee, and the storm kept going outside. After a while, Garrett and Donovan went back to the bunkhouse. Mara and Cade sat at the table with what was left of the coffee. "The fence will need proper repair tomorrow," he said. "I know. If the storm breaks, it'll break," she said. She didn't know that, but she was very tired and sometimes you just said things. He looked at her across the table. His coat was hung by the door, his hair still damp from the snow, and he looked more tired than she usually saw him. Not defeated, just worn down to something more honest than his usual surface. "You should have stayed inside," he said. But he said it without conviction, like a line he felt obligated to deliver. "You needed the hands," she said. "Yes." "Then there's nothing else to say about it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Mara." She looked at him. "When this is resolved," he stopped. Started again with the care of a man choosing specific words. "When the spring comes and the judge rules, and this is settled one way or another, what do you want?" She looked at him across the table, in the lamplight, with the storm pushing at the walls of the house around them. It was not a small question. It was not, she understood, entirely about land. She had not let herself think about it in those terms. She had kept herself focused on the immediate, on the legal, on the practical, because the practical was what she could control, and what I want was a territory she had not had the luxury of visiting in a very long time. She thought about it now. "I want my children to grow up knowing that land is theirs," she said. "I want them to have something solid under their feet." She paused. "And I don't want to be only surviving anymore." She hadn't planned to say the last part. It came out of the tiredness, maybe, or the honesty that 4 in the morning tends to produce. Cade looked at her steadily. His hands were around his coffee cup, and he didn't look away. "That's reasonable," he said. Just that. Not a promise, not a declaration. Just the acknowledgement that what she wanted was reasonable, which somehow landed more squarely than either of the other things would have. The storm went on outside. The lamp burned low on the table. Neither of them moved to go to bed. The storm broke on Monday afternoon, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt imposed. The ranch emerged from under 2 feet of snow with the stunned, blinking quality of something that had been held underwater and released. Fence posts capped white, the barn roof buried under a smooth, unbroken layer, the cattle standing in the lower pasture with their breath rising in steady columns. The sky that replaced the storm was a hard, brilliant blue, the kind that appears after serious weather as if the atmosphere is overcompensating. Mara stood on the porch with her coffee and looked at all of it and felt, despite everything, something close to gratitude for the simple fact of the ranch still standing. The conversation from 4 in the morning had not been revisited. She and Cade had both gone to bed eventually, and in the daylight neither of them had returned to it, which she suspected was a mutual and unspoken agreement to let it settle at its own pace. She was not unhappy about that. She had enough to manage without also managing whatever was quietly rearranging itself between them. The fence repairs took 3 days. Cade worked alongside Garrett and Donovan from first light to last, and Mara brought food out at midday and worked the shorter sections herself, learning the mechanics of post-setting from Donovan, who showed her without condescension and corrected her grip on the mallet in a way that was purely practical. Her hands were blistered by the second day. She wrapped them and kept working. Tommy watched from the porch the first morning, vibrating with the desire to help, until Mara gave him a task that was legitimate but controlled, keeping count of the replaced posts in a notebook, which gave him a number to report at dinner and the dignity of having contributed something real. Ellie sat with Captain the Barn Cat on the porch steps and drew what appeared to be a map of the ranch in the snow with a stick, narrating something to herself in a low voice that Mara couldn't quite hear. On the third day, Forsyth's letter arrived from Billings. She read it standing in the kitchen with her coat still on, having come in from the fence line, and Cade came in behind her and read it over her shoulder, which he did without asking, and she permitted without comment, which was itself a sign of how much had shifted between them in the preceding weeks. The emergency motion to freeze the boundary dispute had been denied. The circuit court judge, not the Harmon-connected one, but the other, a man named Callister, had ruled that the existing territorial assessor's documentation was sufficient to establish the legal status quo pending the full hearing, and that neither party was to disturb the boundary markers or the other party's use of their respective land. It was not a victory. The spring hearing was still coming, and Callister's ruling specifically noted that his denial of the emergency motion was procedural and not indicative of any finding on the merits. But it was ground held. It was the court declining to hand the Harmon Syndicate what they wanted quickly, which meant the Harmon Syndicate was going to have to wait until spring and make their case properly. Forsyth thinks Callister is straight, Mara said. He is, as far as I know him. Old school. He'll hear the evidence and rule on it. Cade stepped back from her shoulder and leaned against the counter. That's all we need. And the spring hearing, we need that too. Yes, he said. We need that too. She put the letter on the table. She pulled off her coat and hung it by the door. And then she stood for a moment looking at nothing in particular, letting the relief settle through her in the complicated way relief does when you know the fight isn't finished. I'm going to make dinner, she said, because she needed to do something concrete. Mara. She turned. He was looking at her with the expression she was learning to read, the one where he had something to say and was deciding whether to say it. What? She said. You held the line. She looked at him. We held it. He considered that for a moment, then nodded once, accepting the correction she understood rather than conceding it. There was a difference, and they both knew it. She turned back to the stove. Done. December arrived, and with it the particular rhythms of a Montana winter in full operation. The days shortened to something barely worth calling days, light arriving late and leaving early as if it had somewhere more important to be. The cold was constant and serious. The ranch contracted inward the way ranches do. The perimeter of daily life shrinking to the house, the barn, the path between them, the larger world receding to something theoretical. And in that contracted space, 4 people and 1 elderly housekeeper and a barn cat learned, slowly and without deciding to, how to be something that resembled a household. It happened in small increments that Mara noticed only in retrospect. Cade had begun asking the children questions at dinner, not performing interest, but actual questions, the kind that required actual answers. He asked Tommy about what he'd learned from Garrett that day with the specific follow-up questions of someone genuinely curious, which meant Tommy talked for entire meals and went to bed satisfied. He asked Ellie things more carefully, understanding without being told that she required a different approach, that she didn't answer on demand but would answer given space. So he asked and then waited, and the answer came eventually, sometimes minutes later, sometimes the next morning. Ellie had started bringing Captain inside. This was technically against Mrs. Aldridge's rules. The first time it happened, Mrs. Aldridge discovered the cat asleep on the kitchen chair and said, in her direct way, "That animal does not belong in the house." Ellie looked at her with the particular steady gaze she used when she was prepared to be patient about something. "He was cold," she said. Mrs. Aldridge looked at the cat. The cat looked at Mrs. Aldridge. Something passed between them that Mara, watching from the doorway, could not quite categorize. "He stays off the food surfaces," Mrs. Aldridge said, and went back to the stove. Captain slept by the kitchen hearth from that point forward. Mara had expected Tommy to test Cade more than he did. He was 8, newly settled in a new place with a man who was not his father, and the combination of those things was the kind of thing that produced difficult behavior in children. There was some of it, the occasional deliberate infraction, the backtalk that appeared on the days when he was tired or unsettled, the argument about bedtime that happened twice and was not handled perfectly by anyone involved. But Tommy was also watching Cade with the careful attention of a child who is trying to understand what category of man he is dealing with, and apparently whatever he was concluding satisfied him at some level, because the resistance was never sustained. The moment she understood this clearly came on a Thursday afternoon when she heard Cade's voice from the barn, low and even, and Tommy's voice responding. She had gone to the barn door and listened without going in, and what she heard was Cade explaining something about the horses, some technical thing about reading a horse's temperament from the way it held its ears, and Tommy listening with the concentrated silence he only produced when he was genuinely interested. "How do you know all this stuff?" Tommy said. "Learned it over a long time," Cade said. "Made a lot of mistakes first." "What kind of mistakes?" "The kind where a horse throws you and you have to figure out what you did wrong." "Did you get hurt?" "Sometimes." "Did it stop you from riding?" A pause. "No." "Why not?" Another pause, longer. "Because giving up a thing because it's hard once doesn't make sense. You only give up a thing if the whole project is wrong. Getting thrown isn't the project being wrong. It's part of learning it." Mara had stood in the cold outside the barn door for a moment, listening to the silence that followed. Then she went back to the house. She did not say anything about it. Some things, she had learned, were better left to develop without commentary. January brought another set of letters from Forsyth, these ones substantive. The spring hearing had been formally scheduled for the second week of March, and Forsyth was building the case around the 1871 survey, the assessor's confirmation, and the chain of title that ran from the original land grant through Jacob Calloway to Mara. He requested a meeting in Billings in February to go over the materials, and he was specific about wanting Mara present because her testimony about the history of the property and the harassment they had experienced would be relevant. She wrote back confirming she would be there. What she had not anticipated was what arrived the second week of January, not from Forsyth, not from the Harmon lawyers, but from the East, specifically from Ohio. The letter was written in a careful, formal hand and signed by a man named Gerald Sutton, who identified himself as Jacob Calloway's uncle by marriage. He had written on behalf of himself and his wife, who was Jacob's mother's sister, to express their concern for the welfare of Thomas and Eleanor Calloway, Tommy and Ellie, who had apparently been of interest to the Sutton family in ways that had not previously manifested as contact while Jacob was alive. He wrote that he and his wife were prepared to offer the children a proper home in Cincinnati, with access to good schools and the kind of stable, established environment that, he implied with careful language, could not reasonably be provided by a young widow in the middle of a legal dispute in Montana territory. Mara read it 3 times. Then she set it face down on the table and walked outside to the porch and stood in the January cold without her coat until she had her breath back, which took several minutes. Cade found her there. He looked at her face and then at the door behind her. "What happened?" She went inside and gave him the letter. She stood by the window while he read it and watched his expression move through something that was one of the more readable things she had seen on his face. "Who are these people?" he said. "Jacob's family, technically, by some degrees." She turned from the window. "I met Gerald Sutton twice, both times at Jacob's mother's funeral, 7 years ago. He didn't write when Jacob was ill. He didn't write when Jacob died." She paused. "He writes now." "Because of the land dispute," Cade said. Not a question. "Because of the land dispute. If I lose in March, the children become more sympathetic. A widow who lost everything. If I win, the water rights make the Calloway inheritance suddenly worth something." She sat down at the table. "Either way, he's calculating." Cade set the letter on the table. He stood with his arms crossed and the expression he had when he was done collecting information and was moving to a decision. "What do you want to do about it?" he said. I want to ignore it, she said, but I can't. A letter like this could be the opening of a legal action, and if he finds a lawyer willing to argue, the children would be better placed in a settled household. He won't find one that'll get anywhere, Cade said. You don't know that. Mara. He said it with a quietness that had weight to it. Those children are Mercer's, by law and by record, and by everything that's been true since October. He paused. Nobody is taking them anywhere. She looked at him. She had been managing the cold anger of the letter alone since she read it, keeping it compartmentalized in the way she kept everything managed, and the directness of what he said hit a place that was not entirely ready for it. It's not that simple, she said, keeping her voice even. The legal part of it is. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Write to Forsyth today and send him this letter. He needs to know there's a potential third-party complication. Then we write back to Sutton. Together. And make the situation clear. And what is the situation exactly? He looked at her across the table. The situation is that your children are where they belong, with their family, and no one in Cincinnati has any standing to suggest otherwise. She held his gaze for a long moment. The anger was still there, toward Sutton, toward the calculation she could read behind his careful language. But underneath it, something else was happening, something she had been carefully not naming for months. All right, she said, we write back together. They wrote the letter that evening. Cade drafted the legal language and Mara wrote the personal sections, and the finished document was polite, precise, and entirely unambiguous. It acknowledged Gerald Sutton's concern, stated clearly that Thomas and Eleanor Mercer were settled, healthy, and appropriately cared for, noted the legal standing of their current household, and expressed that any further correspondence should be directed to Forsyth. Mara sealed it herself. Do you think he'll push further? She said. Depends on who he talks to, Cade said. If someone's been feeding him information about the land dispute specifically to use as leverage, he might. If he's acting on his own, probably not. He looked at the sealed letter. Either way, we've answered it. She nodded. She set the letter by the door to go out with the next day's post. She was tired, the specific weariness of a person who keeps having to fight on multiple fronts and cannot get ahead of the next thing before the current thing is finished. She sat down on the kitchen bench, which she did not usually do. Usually she kept moving, kept doing something, because stopping left too much space for the things she was managing not to think about. She sat there anyway. After a moment, Cade sat beside her, not across the table, which was where they usually were, beside her on the bench, close enough that she was aware of his physical presence in a way she usually kept at the edge of her attention. You're exhausted, he said. Yes. You don't let yourself be tired. I can't afford to be tired. You're being tired right now, he said. Not unkindly, just accurately. She looked at her hands in her lap. I keep thinking about what I told you in the storm, that I don't want to be only surviving. She paused. I'm not sure I know how to do anything else anymore. It's been a long time. He was quiet for a moment. How long? She thought about it honestly. Since before Jacob died. He was sick for a year before the end, and before that there was the first marriage, it was different, harder in different ways. She shook her head slightly. I don't know. A long time. You're not only surviving, he said. She looked at him. He was close, and the lamplight was doing what lamplight does in January kitchens, and his face had the honesty it got when the hour was late and there was nobody watching. What am I doing then? She asked. He looked at her with the directness that was the truest thing about him, the quality she had come to trust most over the preceding months. Building something, he said. It just doesn't feel like that from inside it. She looked at him for a moment longer than she meant to. Then she looked away. We should sleep, she said. Yes, he said. Neither of them moved for another minute. February arrived, and with it, the trip to Billings. She left the children with Mrs. Aldridge and Garrett, gave Tommy a list of responsibilities that satisfied his need to be useful, and hugged Ellie for longer than she usually allowed herself in the morning when she needed to be practical. Ellie patted her back with the small, serious hands she had. Come back, Ellie said, which was not a question. Always, Mara said, which was a promise she intended to keep. Cade drove her to Black Hollow to catch the stage, and at the stage depot he waited until the horses were hitched and the driver had loaded the bag, And then he said, "Forsyth knows his business. Answer his questions straight. Don't clean anything up." "I know," she said. "And come back in one piece." She looked at him standing in the February cold with his hat in his hand, and she thought, not for the first time, that there was nothing simple about what had happened between them, nothing that could be condensed into easy categories. He was not a romantic figure. He was difficult and private and wore his own history like a coat he never fully took off. He had bruises she didn't know the origin of, and silences she hadn't found the bottom of. He had agreed to something extraordinary for reasons that were still only half explained, and he had kept his word so completely and so consistently that she had stopped waiting for him not to. "I'll come back," she said. She got on the stage. The meeting with Forsyth lasted 2 days. He was a careful man, meticulous, and he took her through the entire history of the property from Jacob's original purchase forward, stopping to ask specific questions about dates, about the specific men who had visited, about the exact language of threats that had been delivered. He had a way of listening that made you feel like everything you said was being properly filed, which was the most reassuring quality a lawyer could have. On the second day, he told her plainly that he believed the case was strong. "The 1871 survey is the foundation," he said. "It predates any of the Harmon Company's activity in the valley by 15 years. The chain of title is clean. The assessor's confirmation is solid." He paused in the way that lawyers pause before the part you're not going to like. "The challenge will be if they can produce a competing survey or find a technical defect in the original document. Their Helena lawyers are good. They'll look for something. And if they find something, then we argue that the totality of the evidence supports your position. We have the preponderance standard in civil matters. We don't need perfect. We need more convincing." He looked at her over his papers. "I believe we have it." She rode the stage back to Black Hollow on the third day and arrived at dusk to find Cade at the depot. She had not expected him to be there. She had told him the return date, but she had not asked him to come, and the stage from Billings was not something that required meeting. He was there anyway, with the wagon, in the cold. She climbed down from the stage and looked at him. "You didn't have to come." "I know," he said. He took her bag without asking. She stood there for a moment on the depot platform in the February dusk, cold and tired, and more grateful than she had the words for. And something she had been holding very carefully for 4 months shifted slightly in her chest, like ice beginning to move in spring. Not breaking yet, but no longer entirely fixed. She walked to the wagon and got in. On the ride back to the ranch, he asked about Forsyth, and she told him everything, accurately and completely, because that was what they did. They told each other things straight, without softening them into something easier but less true. He listened and asked questions and said that Forsyth's assessment matched his own reading of the situation. When the ranch came into view, the lights in the windows, smoke from the chimneys, the dark bulk of the barn against the pale winter sky, she felt something loosen in her shoulders that she hadn't known was tight. "Tommy broke a window," Cade said, into the silence. She turned. "Which one?" "Kitchen side. He was throwing rocks at a knot on the fence post, and his arithmetic was off." She pressed her fingers to her forehead. "Is he all right?" "Completely fine. Deeply remorseful. Spent an hour helping Garrett board it up and has apologized to Mrs. Aldridge 4 times. A pause. "She's made it worse by forgiving him." Mara dropped her hand. "She forgave him?" "Apparently. She said something about boys doing what boys do, and then gave him a piece of the bread she'd been saving for tomorrow." He glanced at her sideways. "He'll be impossible for a week." She almost laughed. It came up unexpectedly, the way laughter sometimes did when you were tired and relieved, and she caught it before it fully escaped, but not quite. Cade noticed. He said nothing about it, but his expression did something she was beginning to recognize, that slight shift at the corner of his mouth. They pulled up to the house. Before she could reach for the door, Tommy erupted from the porch at speed, arms out, hitting her midsection with the enthusiasm of someone who has been waiting for an acceptable amount of time to express something he'd been keeping contained. "I broke a window," he said, face pressed against her coat. "I heard," she said, getting her arms around him. "I fixed it, though." "I heard that, too." Ellie appeared more quietly, as she always did, and stood at Mara's side and put her hand in hers, and didn't say anything at all, which was everything. The weeks between February and March moved with the double quality of time that is both too fast and too slow. Each day individually long, the accumulation of them terrifyingly brief. Mara and Forsyth exchanged letters. The Harmon lawyers filed additional documents that Forsyth filed responses to. The legal machinery ground forward at its own pace, indifferent to the human lives caught in it. On the ranch, the work continued as it always did. Animals to tend, equipment to maintain, accounts to manage, meals to make. The snow began to recede in the second week of February, not gone but retreating, the south-facing slopes showing bare brown earth by afternoon. The creek that ran along the north fence showed a thin dark line of moving water where it had been ice for months. One evening in late February, Mara was in the parlor with the account books when she heard the door and looked up to find Cade in the doorway. He had a letter in his hand. She looked at it. Sutton? No. He came into the room and sat in the chair across from her. The Harmon lawyers to Forsyth with a copy sent here directly. He set it on the table between them. They want to settle. She stared at him. What? They're offering to drop the territorial challenge and withdraw their competing survey in exchange for a right-of-way access for their eastern properties across the northern edge of the Clearwater parcel. She picked up the letter. She read it carefully. The language was different from all the previous letters. Less aggressive, more careful, the particular carefulness of people who have had their attorneys assess a situation and received news they didn't like. They know they're going to lose in March, she said. Forsyth thinks so. A right-of-way is worth something to them. That access would let them move cattle from their eastern holdings without the long way around. But they'd be giving up the challenge and the water dispute entirely. Mara set the letter down. She thought about the past 5 months. She thought about the cut on Cade's cheek, and the men in the tree line, and the letter from Gerald Sutton, and the storm, and 3 hours in the dark fixing fence line, and the telegram from Forsyth about the emergency motion being denied, and the specific quality of fear that had lived in her chest since October, the kind you don't fully know is there until it starts, slowly, to ease. What's your read? She said. The right-of-way is a genuine ask, not a trick. That access is worth money to them. He paused. The alternative is the hearing in March, which I believe we win, but courts are courts. We could win in March and get the full resolution. Yes. Or we settle now and it's done. Yes. She looked at the letter. A right-of-way I can live with. It's land I'm not using anyway. But I want specific conditions, written terms, no expansion of the right-of-way without renegotiation, and I want a formal written withdrawal of every legal challenge, not just a pause. That's what I'd ask for, he said. Then write to Forsyth tonight. She handed him the letter. He took it. Their fingers didn't touch, not quite, but the exchange had the particular quality of something passed between two people who have learned to rely on each other. Easy, practiced, no hesitation on either side. Mara, he said. She looked at him. When this is over... He stopped. It was the second time he had started a sentence that way. The second time since the 4 a.m. conversation in the storm. She waited. When this is over, he said, with more deliberateness, I want to talk about what this is. She held his gaze. Her heart was doing something she had been declining to comment on for several weeks. All right, she said. All right, he said. He went to write to Forsyth. She sat in the parlor with the account books open in her lap and not looked at, the fire burning low in the grate, the house quiet around her. Outside the window, the February dark had the particular quality of a season holding itself at the edge of changing. Cold still, but differently cold. The cold of something almost finished rather than something just beginning. She sat there for a long time and let herself feel it. Not the fear, not the management, not the calculation of the next necessary thing. Just the weight of what had been built here, in this house, in this strange and practical and genuine life. The improbable, unglamorous, completely real weight of it. She was not, she realized, only surviving. She hadn't been for some time. The settlement documents arrived on a Wednesday morning in the first week of March, 3 days before the hearing would have taken place. Forsyth sent them by express post with a cover letter that was, for a man of his professional restraint, almost effusive. He wrote that the terms were exactly what they had requested, that the Harmon Company's withdrawal was complete and legally binding, and that he had rarely seen a case turn so decisively on the strength of documentary evidence combined with, as he put it, the consistent and visible resolve of his clients. Mara read that last part twice. Consistent and visible resolve. She supposed that was one way to describe what the past 5 months had been. She signed the documents at the kitchen table with Cade beside her, both of them reading every clause before either of them put pen to paper, because that was how they did things. When it was done, she set the pen down and looked at the signatures, hers and his, side by side on the settlement agreement, on the formal withdrawal of the territorial challenge, on the right-of-way terms that she had dictated and Forsyth had made legally airtight. She didn't feel what she had expected to feel. She had anticipated something larger, relief that crashed over you, or triumph, or the particular lightness of a weight finally lifted. What she actually felt was quieter than any of those things. More like the feeling of setting down something heavy that you had been carrying so long you had forgotten it had weight. Not a dramatic release, just the absence of the thing, slowly becoming real. "It's done," she said. "It's done," Cade said. Across the kitchen, Mrs. Aldridge was making bread. She did not turn around. But Mara saw her shoulders do something, a small, private adjustment, the kind a person makes when they have been holding themselves carefully and are now, cautiously, not. Tommy and Ellie were at the table doing their lessons. Tommy looked up. "Is it the land thing?" he said. Mara looked at her son. He had grown an inch since October, she was almost certain, and his face had lost some of the particular soft roundness of younger childhood. He was watching her with the attentive eyes of someone who had understood more of the preceding months than she had always given him credit for. "Yes," she said, "the land thing." He nodded slowly, processing this, then, "So we don't have to worry anymore?" She thought about how to answer that honestly. "Not about that specifically," she said. "There'll be other things to worry about. There always are. But not that. Not that." He seemed to weigh this, then he went back to his slate. Ellie had not looked up during the exchange, but she reached across the table and put her hand briefly over Tommy's in the way she sometimes did, a small, sideways gesture that he tolerated from her and only from her. And then she went back to her own work. Mara watched them and felt something that was not complicated at all. It was the simplest feeling she had had in a long time. Spring came to Montana the way it always does, reluctantly, arguing with winter the whole way. March was cold still, with 2 more snowstorms that Mara no longer dreaded the way she had the January one, having now survived enough of them to understand they were endurable. The creek on the north fence ran clear and strong when the snow melted, the water brown with sediment and moving fast, exactly as the survey had described it. Mara walked to it one morning in late March with her boots sinking into the saturated ground and stood on the bank and listened to it. Water. Moving on her land. Legal and documented and no longer disputed. She crouched down and put her hand in it. It was very cold. She stayed there longer than made practical sense, and she did not feel foolish about it. The Clearwater parcel became operational in April. Cade lent her 3 hands for the initial work: fencing, clearing the overgrown sections, establishing the access points, and she managed the operation herself, making decisions about which sections to graze first and how to rotate the use to keep the land healthy. She had not ranched before, not at this scale, but she had managed property and she had watched Cade work for 6 months, and she asked questions when she didn't know something, which it turned out was the most efficient way to learn anything. Garrett rode out with her one afternoon to assess the northwest section, the one closest to the creek, and she asked him what he thought about the soil quality for winter grazing. He scratched the back of his neck, which was his thinking gesture. "It's good," he said. "Better than the Mercer South pasture, honestly. If you get it cleared proper before September, you could winter 20 head here without trouble." 30, if the creek stays reliable? He considered. "Maybe. I'd say 25 to be safe the first year. You don't know how it drains yet." 25 then, she said. "We'll see what the first winter tells us." He nodded and they rode back, and she made a note in the account book that evening. 25 head, northwest section, first winter. She was building something with numbers now, not just defending something with words. The difference felt significant. She had not forgotten the conversation in the parlor. Cade's unfinished sentence, the one he had started twice, "When this is over," and the agreement they had made to talk about what this was. They had not talked about it yet, not directly. The settlement had been followed by the work of spring, which was relentless and practical, and generated its own momentum, and she and Cade had moved through it side by side the way they had learned to move through most things, efficiently, without wasted energy, communicating in the shorthand of people who have spent enough time together that half a sentence carries all the meaning. She was not avoiding it. She admitted to herself, not entirely sure what she wanted to say. She had been loved before. She knew what that was. Jacob had loved her genuinely, and she had loved him back, and she knew what that architecture felt like from the inside, the specific warmth of it, the particular safety. She had also lost it, which meant she knew what that felt like too. The specific cold of an absence where something important had been. What she felt about Cade was not the same thing, or not yet the same shape. It was harder, less comfortable, built from a different kind of material. It had grown in the dark, during practical conversations and fence repairs and late nights over land documents, and it had the quality of something that had not been chosen in a single moment, but had assembled itself out of 100 small choices over months. She thought about what he had said to her in October, on the first morning over coffee in the gray pre-dawn light. I did what I chose to do, and later, it stopped being only your problem about 2 weeks after you arrived. And the thing he had said in the kitchen during the storm, when she was too tired to be careful, building something. It just doesn't feel like that from inside it. She thought he had been talking about more than the land. On a Saturday morning in mid-April, with the light finally carrying genuine warmth again, and the ranch smelling of mud and new grass, she found him at the corral watching Garrett work a young horse through a pattern. He was leaning on the top rail with his arms folded, hat pushed back slightly, and he had the particular stillness he got when he was thinking rather than watching. She came to stand beside him. They watched the horse for a while. Garrett called something across the corral, and the horse adjusted, ears forward, settling into the rhythm he was asking for. "The Northwest Section assessment looks good," she said. "I heard Garrett's usually right about soil." 25 head first winter. "Reasonable," he said. "Conservative, but reasonable." "I'd rather be wrong that direction than the other." "Yes," he said. "Me too." A pause. The horse moved in a circle. "Cade," he turned his head to look at her. "You said you wanted to talk," she said. "When it was over." He looked at her steadily. "Yes, it's over." "Yes," he said. "It is." He pushed off the fence rail and turned to face her properly, which meant she had to look up at him, which she did without particular difficulty, having had 6 months of practice. "I'm not good at this," he said. Came out bluntly, which she appreciated, because she was tired of conversations that worked up to things through excessive preamble. "At talking? At this specifically?" He made a small gesture that seemed to include both of them and the space between them. "I've spent a long time not wanting anything I didn't already have. Not because I was content, because wanting things you don't have is expensive and I'd learned to economize." He paused. "You made that harder." She held his gaze. "I made wanting things harder?" "Easier," he said, "which made it harder." She almost smiled. "That's a complicated sentence." "It's a complicated situation." "It is," she agreed. "We married each other in 11 minutes for reasons that had nothing to do with this." "Yes. And then we spent 6 months in the same house, fighting the same people and building the same things." "Yes. And now the people are gone, and the things are built, and here we are." "Here we are," he said. She looked at him, at the face she had been reading for 6 months, the one that still didn't give everything away but gave considerably more than it used to. The scar along his jaw, the gray at his temples, the eyes that paid attention to things, to her specifically, in a way she had come to trust the way you trust solid ground under your feet. "I don't know what I want this to be," she said. "I know what it's been. I don't know what comes next." "That's honest," he said. "I'm always honest." "I know." He looked at her for a moment. "I'm not asking you to decide anything today. I'm asking you to stop pretending you don't know what's been happening." She felt the precise accuracy of that. She had been careful, deliberately, rationally careful, not to name the thing that had been assembling itself in her chest since October, because naming it made it real, and real things could be lost, and she was very, very tired of losing things. "I'm not pretending," she said. I'm being cautious. There's a difference, he agreed. I understand the difference. He paused. I'm not going anywhere. I'm not asking you to be less careful than you are. I'm just telling you that what I chose in October, I'd choose again. Not because you needed it, because I wanted to. She looked at him standing in the April light with the corral behind him and the young horse moving in its circle and the Montana spring coming in around them after the longest winter she could remember. She thought about what it meant. Not the romance novel version of it, not the cleaned-up version, but the actual meaning of a person saying plainly that they had chosen you, not out of obligation or calculation, but out of something more honest than either. She thought she could probably be less cautious than she had been. All right, she said. He looked at her. All right, what? All right, I know what's been happening. She held his gaze. And I'd choose it again, too. Something crossed his face. Not the barely there shift she had been learning to read, but something larger, less managed, more like the expression she had seen in the storm when their faces were close in the dark, and neither of them had said anything about it afterward. He reached out and took her hand, which he had never done, and held it for a moment in the April air. Her hand still had calluses from the fence work. His did too. There was nothing romantic about the specific texture of it. It was just two hands that had done difficult things, holding each other in ordinary daylight. It was enough. It was more than enough. Garrett came around the fence with the horse and saw them and made an admirable effort to find somewhere else to look. The feed needs checking, he said, to nobody, and went toward the barn at a pace slightly faster than the situation required. Mara let out a short breath that was almost a laugh. Cade's mouth did the thing at the corner. She did not pull her hand away. Summer came on properly in June, and the ranch entered the productive season with the full weight of two operations behind it, Mercer Ranch and the Clearwater parcel running as connected but distinct enterprises, the account books expanding to reflect the new complexity, the hands working longer days with the increased land under management. Tommy turned 9 in July, and Cade gave him his own horse, a dun gelding, 5 years old, steady-tempered, which produced the single most sustained period of speechless emotion Mara had ever witnessed in her son. He stood in the barn with his hand on the horse's neck and didn't say anything for a full minute, which was unprecedented. "What are you going to call him?" Garrett asked. Tommy thought about it seriously. "Surveyor," he said. Garrett looked at the horse. "That's a lot of name for a horse." "He can grow into it," Tommy said, which was something he had heard Mara say about him and had apparently filed away for future use. Ellie's 6th birthday in August was quieter, more in keeping with her particular character. She asked for a book, specifically a book about animals, birds if possible, and Mara ordered one from the catalog in Billings that arrived 2 weeks late and slightly damaged at one corner, which Ellie did not mind at all. She spent the afternoon of her birthday on the porch with Captain asleep beside her, reading with the concentrated stillness that she brought to things she genuinely cared about. In the evening, Cade sat beside her and she showed him a page with an illustration of a great gray owl and explained at length, in the precise detail she reserved for subjects of interest, what the book had told her about how it hunted. He listened to all of it. Then he said, "There are great gray owls on the ridge. I've seen them at dawn." Ellie looked at him with the expression she reserved for information she found genuinely valuable. "Can we go see them?" "Early," he said, "before the light changes." "I don't mind early," she said. "I know," he said. "Neither do I." Mara watched them from the kitchen doorway and felt the particular quality of a moment. You know, even while you're in it, that you are going to remember. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's exactly right in a way that has nothing to do with perfection. The cat asleep on the porch boards, the child with her book, the man who had ridden before dawn for 6 months to keep them safe, now sitting in the evening light talking about owls with a 6-year-old who trusted him. Life had a way of building things in the dark, and then showing them to you in daylight when you weren't braced for it. Gerald Sutton wrote one more time in September. The letter was brief and notably different in tone from the January one, quieter, less formal, and with an undertone that Mara read as a man who had been advised by someone with legal knowledge to reconsider his position. He wrote that he was glad to hear the children were settled and well, that he and his wife hoped circumstances permitted a visit at some point in the future, and that he sent his regards to Mr. Mercer. Mara wrote back a short, courteous reply that left the door neither open nor closed. She was not interested in cruelty toward a man who had ultimately done nothing worse than be calculating and cowardly, and she was also not interested in pretending the January letter hadn't happened. She mentioned it to Cade that evening. "He backed down," she said. "People usually do," Cade said, "when the leverage they were counting on doesn't materialize." "He doesn't get to know them," she said. "Not until they're old enough to make that choice themselves." He looked at her. "That's their call to make when the time comes." "Yes," she said. "It is." She paused. "I'll keep the letters, both of them, so they can decide what they want to do with the information when they're grown." He nodded once. "That's fair." It was fair. Not easy, not clean, but fair, which was the standard she had learned to hold herself to over the course of the preceding year, because easy and clean were not things Montana offered, and fair was something you could actually achieve with enough commitment. October came around again. 1 year since the wagon had rolled into Black Hollow under a bruised sky. 1 year since the 11-minute ceremony in Alderman's office. 1 year since 2 strangers had sat across a saloon table and made a practical agreement that had become, by degrees and difficulty and shared winter, something neither of them had been planning on. Mara was on the ridge above the Clearwater parcel when the anniversary occurred to her. She was checking the fence on the northwest section, a routine ride, nothing urgent, and she had stopped to look at the land below her, the way you stop sometimes when a view opens up and demands a moment. The creek ran below, still strong in the early fall before the cold slowed it. The pasture in the northwest corner was grazed down to the healthy level she'd been aiming for. The cattle settled in the easy way of animals that have good water and good grass and nothing pressing them. The fence line ran clean and straight in the clear October air. It was not a spectacular view, not in any postcard sense. It was just land, complicated, imperfect, rained on and frozen and worked hard and currently, stubbornly, hers. She heard hoofbeats and looked over her shoulder. Cade came up the ridge path and stopped beside her. He looked at the land below and then at her. "What are you doing up here?" he said. "Thinking," she said. He settled his horse beside hers. They looked at the pasture together. "It's 1 year," she said. "I know. It's different than I expected." "What did you expect?" She thought about it honestly. "I expected to still be fighting. I expected it to still feel like survival." She looked at the creek below. "It doesn't feel like that anymore." "What does it feel like?" he said. She looked at him. He was watching her with the directness that had never changed in a year, the same quality of attention he had been paying her since the afternoon in the saloon, only now it was informed by a year of everything that had come after. "Like mine," she said. "Like ours." She paused. "Like something that's going to last." He looked at her steadily. "It is," he said. "Not a promise with ceremony around it. Just a statement of fact." Said the way he said facts, plainly, without decoration, with the weight of a man who did not say things he didn't mean. She had learned, over the course of a year, to trust plain things. Decorated things could be anything. Plain things were what they were. "I need to tell you something," he said. She waited. "I didn't agree to that arrangement in October because of Jacob, or because of the Harmon Syndicate, or Harlan Briggs, or any of the reasons I gave you." He looked at the land below them, then back at her. "I agreed because you walked into that saloon and sat down without waiting to be asked, and you told me the truth about what you needed without dressing it up or making it easier than it was. And I hadn't met many people who did that." He paused. "I hadn't met anyone in a long time who I wanted to sit across a table from and just be honest with." Mara looked at him on the ridge in the October light, 1 year of consequence behind them and the land they had fought for spread below. She thought about honesty, what it had cost them to practice it with each other, how rarely people actually offered it without trimming it first into something more presentable. "I know," she said. "I felt it too. I was just too scared to say so." "You weren't scared," he said. "You were sensible." "I was both," she said. "Most real things are." He reached over and took her hand on the reins, the same way he had in April, simply, without announcement. Her hand had new calluses now, different ones, the ones from a full summer of working her own land instead of defending it. They sat on the ridge above the Clearwater parcel and looked at what they had built, and neither of them said anything else for a while, because there wasn't anything else that needed saying. Below, the creek ran on. The winters that followed were not easier exactly. Montana did not offer easier winters. There were seasons that tested the fences and the cattle and the patience of everyone on the property, years when the spring was late and the accounts were tight and the work was heavier than anyone had the energy for. Cade got sick one February, and Mara ran both operations herself for 3 weeks, badly in some ways and adequately in others, making mistakes and correcting them and keeping everything moving because the alternative was not acceptable. He recovered, and when he was well enough to come back to the accounts, he looked at what she had done and said, without embellishment, "You managed it." "Buipati sasikits." "Not perfectly," she said. "Well enough," he said, which from him was the same as a great deal more. She found, as the years settled into their shape, that she was not interested in revising the story she lived into something cleaner than it was. The marriage had begun as a transaction. The love that followed was real, but it had been built out of difficulty and friction and two people who were both, in their specific ways, not easy to know. It had the texture of something made by hand rather than by luck, and she preferred that. Luck ran out. Things made by hand held. Tommy grew into a young man who knew horses and land and could read a legal document and run a fence line and argue a position without backing down, which Mara considered a satisfactory outcome for a child she had spent the better part of his early years worrying about. He was not simple or easy. He was stubborn and loyal and occasionally infuriating, and he carried some of Cade's particular quality of stillness alongside the recklessness that was entirely his own. Ellie grew into someone different, precise, observant, with a lateral intelligence that kept arriving at the right answer from directions nobody else had considered. She read everything she could get her hands on and asked questions that made adults think. When she was 12, she told Mara that she wanted to study law, which Mara heard without blinking and said, "We'll make that happen." They did. The town of Black Hollow did what small towns do. It changed and it didn't. Some of the people who had watched with sideways eyes in October of 1883 became, over years, genuine neighbors. Some never did. Mara made peace with the one she could and kept appropriate distance from the one she couldn't, which was the only realistic policy for a person who intended to stay in a place for a long time. The ridge above the Clearwater parcel became, for the Mercer family, something unofficial and unremarked upon. The place they went when something needed thinking through, or when a season ended and another began, or when the ordinary life below had accumulated enough weight that a person needed height and distance to see it clearly. Mara went there on a September afternoon some years after the settlement, older now, the threads of gray in her hair that she wore without self-consciousness. And she stood on the ridge and looked at the land below and let herself feel the full weight of what the view contained. Not the land specifically, what the land represented. The specific, unspectacular, completely unlikely fact of a life that had been built from the ruins of previous lives, not despite the difficulty, but partly because of it. She had come to Black Hollow with $43 and a cracked satchel and 2 children and the desperation of a woman who has run out of easier options. She had stayed because the land was worth staying for. She had found, in the staying, things she had not known to look for. She thought about what she would tell someone who asked her how it had happened. How you built something real from a beginning as improbable as theirs had been. She thought she would say, "You choose. You choose the honest thing over the comfortable thing. You choose to stay when leaving is easier. You choose to trust someone when trust is the most expensive thing you have. And you do it not because you're certain it will work, but because certainty is not actually on offer, and you have to decide what to do in its absence. And then you choose again the next day and the one after that. That's all it is. That's everything it is." She heard hoofbeats on the ridge path. She did not need to look to know who it was. He came up beside her and stopped, and they stood on the ridge above Mercerland in the September light, and the creek ran below them, and the cattle moved in the distant pasture like slow punctuation on a page too large to read all at once, and the sky above the mountains was the particular blue that October would eventually take from them, but not yet. Not yet. "Same view," Cade said. "Every time," she said. He looked at it for a while. Then he looked at her. She looked back. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said, and nothing that needed saying that hadn't already been done. and the silence between them had the quality it had been developing for years. Not empty, but full, carrying everything that two people accumulate when they have been genuinely honest with each other through genuinely difficult things. The wind moved through the grass on the ridge. The creek kept running. The land that had cost so much and given back so much more stretched away below them in every direction, bearing the evidence of every season they had worked it, every winter they had endured, every choice they had made in the direction of staying and building rather than yielding and leaving. On the frontier where fear had once ruled everything, the Mercer name had come to mean something particular. Not power, not wealth, though there was some of both. It meant that when you gave your word, you kept it. That when something was yours, you held it. That when someone needed the truth, you gave it to them without decoration. It meant that you chose, and you kept choosing, and the choosing was the whole of it. Mara Mercer stood on her ridge in the September light and breathed in the cold, clean air coming off the mountains and felt, without surprise and without drama, something she had not been sure she would ever feel again when she climbed down from that wagon in a muddy street under a bruised sky 12 years before. She felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because fate had placed her there, because she had chosen it every day until the choosing became the life itself. That was what they had built. That was what would last.